sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome, everyone, to Pod and Man at Yale. I'm Ari Schaefer, Director of Communications here at the Buckley Institute. Today, we are lucky enough to have a guest host, a special interview led by Editor-in-Chief of the Buckley Beacon, Owen Tillman, who'll be interviewing Bjorn Lomborg.
Welcome to Pod and Man at Yale. I'm Owen Tillman. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Buckley Beacon, the Buckley Institute's student-run paper here at Yale. I'm here with Dr. Bjorn Lomborg. Good to meet you. Thank you so much for being here. For those individuals who don't know who Dr. Lomborg is, he's a Danish political scientist, author, and globally recognized thought leader. He gained international acclaim for his best-selling book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, which I believe is published in 2001. Is that correct? Right. Yes. Sparked widespread debate on environmental priorities, to say the very least. Subsequent works include Cool It, as well as False Alarm, and he continues to challenge conventional approaches to climate change and advocate for data-driven, cost-effective solutions. Did I miss anything?
You actually didn't. I brought that other book because I want to talk about something else apart from this, right? One of the things that happens when we talk a lot about climate is that we forget all the other problems in the world. And remember, for most people on this planet, the worry is not what's going to happen in 100 years with some temperature rise. The worry is that your kids might die from easily curable infectious diseases. You don't have enough food. You're poor. All these other issues. So, yes, I want to squeeze in a little bit of that as well at the end.
There you go. There you go. Well, to supplement the bio then, I guess, first question is, how'd you get into climate science? I imagine you were originally, if I'm not mistaken, in the sort of statistical side of political science. Yep. I forget which university it was.
University of Aarhus in Denmark. Yes.
There you go. So what got you interested in climate science and environmental politics specifically?
So I've always been worried about a lot of things. I think like most sort of standard college students, I had the poster, only when they've caught the last fish and fell the last tree will they realize they can't eat gold, those kinds of things. Turns out it was from a movie in the 1970s, but it was sold as if it was this big Indian sage thinking. I was a member of Greenpeace, again, not out and rub a boat, but just sort of paying due member, worried about the world, worried about a lot of things. And then I had another thing. I was very annoyed about the way that university, and I'm sure you also feel that in some ways. University was very much sort of a sausage factory. You just, you come in one side, they fill you up with a lot of knowledge and you do a lot of multiple choice tests and then you're done kind of thing. And I had thought I was going to see this thing you see in movies where, you're a professor sitting and smoking a pipe and thinking deep thoughts and you would be querying the big issues of the world. And there's nothing of that. And so when I became a lecturer, I was an associate professor at the University of Aarhus, I tried to get my students to actually get a little bit of that experience, right? So I did stuff that was outside the curriculum where we would be talking about a lot of other stuff. And one of the things was I read an interview with an American economist named Julian Simon back in 1998 in Wired magazine, 1997. And he said, things are much better with the environment than you think. And, so I was just irritated. I was like, right-wing American propaganda, But he said one thing that really piqued my interest. He said, go check the data yourself. And that's what I always told my students when I was teaching them statistics. And so I figured, okay, I'll see his book and see if it's, worth anything. And, the book looked like it could actually have a lot of good arguments. So I figured, all right, I'll do one of these sessions where I get students interested in stuff that's outside the curriculum. We'll go through his book. Obviously, he's wrong. I mean, we took that for given that he's wrong. But we would, look at all the UN data, showcase how he was wrong, and learn a lot about the world at the same time. So that was really how this all started. And what happened in that fall of 97 was we went through one chapter after another, and we're like, oh, wait. Yes, he was wrong about something. Yes, he was right-wing. But There's also a lot of stuff that was true. And, it's the very simple point. Air pollution in rich countries has dropped dramatically over the last 100 years. It's sort of obvious if you look back at old pictures, you can sort of see the air pollution there. Now we have some of the cleanest air ever. One of the graphs that I did later on was we have good estimates for London back from 1585 until today. And basically, air pollution has gone up and up and up from 1585, so medieval times, up to about 1890. And then from then on, for the last 130 years plus, air pollution's come down dramatically so that today the air in London is cleaner than it's ever been since medieval times. Look, this means two things, and this is essentially what I then ended up doing. It has become a lot better. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not as good as it needs to be, because it actually turns out air pollution is one of the biggest problems in the world. It's certainly the biggest environmental problem in the world. And so for rich countries, it actually makes sense to say it should be even less. But we're very badly informed if we think, and I think a lot of people have that understanding, that things are just getting worse and worse with everything on environment. No, a lot of things are getting better. Doesn't mean that there's no problems. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be worried about, what should we do next. But it means we can stop having this sense of dread that this is the end of the world. So that was really what got me started. Then I wrote a couple of articles in a Danish newspaper. I thought, that'd be fun. It turned out to, probably the biggest conversation we've had in Denmark since the Second World War. For like 3 months, you couldn't open a paper, any paper. And people were mostly, dissing me, but, saying that's not true, that blah, blah, blah. But it was a very, very interesting conversation. So I wrote a book and then in Danish, and then I wrote The Skeptical Environmentalist in English, and it sort of became a global conversation. And I still think that's the main issue we need to have, a conversation about. The world is actually on pretty much all measurable variables getting better, but there's still lots of problems to fix. But let's stop fixing them because we think this is the end of the world, and then we panic, and then we do something. But let's be smart and think about what can we do best. So, sorry, that was the short version of all the stuff that I've done for the last 25 years. So,
the last 25 years, there you go. Yeah. Well, and in that 25-year period or so, there have been a few characterizations of your work I took note of in preparation for the interview. Climate denier, faux scientist, sophist. These are 3 words from 3 different articles that I read. Why? I guess the next question is why do you think you've gotten as much pushback as you have? Not just from people in politics or people who are perhaps less informed, but also climate scientists and climatologists and individuals who you've interacted with on a scholarly level as well. Why are they so resistant to your point of view?
So I think it's obviously you can't sort of put them all into one. Sure. There's not just one reason for this, but what I try to do is to take a conversation of saying, look, let's get a sense of proportion. So, for instance, on the air pollution, which is by far the biggest environmental problem, by death, also by sort of monetary impact, and that has gone down dramatically. Mm-hmm. A lot of campaigners don't like to hear that because obviously it takes sort of attention away. It shouldn't, because it's still a huge problem in the rich world. And it's actually probably the one that in the rich world we should be most focused on. One of the things that drive me nuts in Europe, probably not so much over here, but in Europe, we burn a lot of wood stoves because, partly people will say it's CO2 neutral and it also feels very cozy and everything. But what you're really doing is you're killing all your neighbors because it's incredibly polluting. So in Prague, for instance, in Eastern Europe, it's a significant part of the air pollution in the cold winter season. And we should just not do that, or we should do it much more efficiently so they don't pollute nearly as much. But then it wouldn't be cozy anymore. So the problem here is we need to get a sense of the proportion and what is it we should be focused on. But that takes away from this overarching, it's the end of the world. So that's sort of the campaigners. But obviously then you would ask, but why are the real scientists?
Sure.
So I think actually a lot of sort of the real scientists get what I say, and a lot of them would also tend to say, yeah, good, it's good that you're saying it, but we should still be concerned. And I totally agree with that. But there's also a lot of these people who straddle a very fine line between saying, I want to be a scientist, but I'm also really worried about the environment. And I want us to spend a lot of money, and I want you to hear this, and I don't want Donald Trump to take anything out of this and out of context and use it against the whole conversation. And I sort of get that idea, but it's really, really wrong when scientists try to pretend to also be politicians at the same time. And again, look, I get that because, and that's probably more true over in the US because you have such a polarized society that you almost can't, sort of step outside your own cohort without sort of being seen like you're arguing for the other side. But I happen to still believe that we actually only do good stuff if we understand the size of the problem and the comparison to everything else. So I get why people get really frustrated. I've really engaged with a lot of these people on a very, very long basis. And fundamentally, I think, they're just wrong. Those arguments, certainly, the climate denier, which people like to throw at me. Well, that's just silly. I very, very bluntly state the UN climate panel report, the IPCC, is right. There is a man-made global warming. The conversation that I have is how bad is it? And I argue it's much less bad than what people talk about. And what are the right solutions? And often turn out that the right solutions are not the ones that you hear about. Sure. So it's a very different conversation, but it's absolutely not one that's a climate denier. But it's a very convenient way because people would much rather, just sort of brush me away and say, oh, let's get back to, worrying intensely, instead of thinking about, all right, let's actually discuss the issues at their own merit.
Sure. Well, and I guess that's really what I'd like to flesh out is, you said repeatedly that it's not the situation of the climate is not as bad as many people sort of purport it to be. Yep. What I guess are perhaps one or two specific claims about the climate that are thrown around kind of colloquially that are abjectly false by your calculations? Like when you say it's not as bad, what are the specific claims I think that you're disputing?
So I think the biggest obvious one is that people talk about this as an existential crisis. If you ask people, a new survey from the OECD shows that 60% of adults in the rich world believe that it's likely or very likely that if we don't fix climate change, it will lead to the end of mankind, the extinction of mankind. And that's just simply absolutely bizarrely wrong. That's just, that is not at all. If you ever bother to actually read, the UN Climate Panel publishes 4,000 pages. Please don't read all of them. They're very, very boring. I'm not sure. I'm sure someone has read all of it, right? But they're very, very good in telling you what are the issues. Right. They tell you there are a lot of issues here. None of these are the end of the world. That's just not on the table. And so when you tell this, and obviously, that was the Biden reference, and everybody else will tell you it's an existential problem for mankind. It's a climate crisis, that kind of thing. That's just not the case. If you look at the best estimates, and again, the only climate economist to get the Nobel Prize, William Nordhaus, one of the most quoted climate scientists, Richard Toll, they both did a meta-study of all the studies of how bad is climate change going to be. And I think this is a good sort of indicator of how it will impact. That's what economists try to do. They say, there'll be more floods, there'll be more heavy precipitation, there'll be more heat waves and hence heat deaths. Also remember there'll be fewer cold deaths. There'll be problems with agriculture. All these. If you try to add up all of that, how big a problem is that? This is trillions of dollars. So a significant problem. But in percent of GDP, which is what they typically do, we're talking about 2 to 3% of GDP by the end of the century. So we would have been 2 to 3% richer had we not had climate change by the end of the century. That's obviously a significant issue. It's also obviously not the end of the world. It's not 90 or 99 or 100%. And this is the crucial bit, just to give you a sense of proportion. The UN estimate that by the end of the century, the average person in the world will be about 450% as rich as he or she is today. That's a fantastic outcome. That's basically that we lift a lot of people out of poverty, that the world would be a much better place in so many different ways by the end of the century. Amazing. But because of climate change, we will not be 450% as rich. It will feel like we're only 435 to 440% as rich. And when I say this, it's kind of hard. You almost also, slightly chuckle because I also feel like, yeah, that's not a big problem. And that's exactly the point. It is an issue. I would much rather be in a world where we make sure we're close to 450% rather than just 435% as rich. But it's not a terrible world by the end of the century that we will only feel like we're 435%. And I think that's the main reason why a lot of people get really annoyed, because the feeling is, certainly when you look in the newspaper, this is the end of the world. This is bigger than anything else we're talking about. And then there's this guy, Bjorn, that comes and says, well, actually, it's the difference between 450% and 435%. It almost sounds like I'm mocking them. And I get that, but it is the data. I think this is the mindset we need to be in. And that, of course, means if we can find a way to fix this problem at a lower cost, let's just go back to the 2 to 3%. If we can find a way to fix the problem, say, for 1%, and it's very hard because this is obviously over time, so I'm making a lot of shortcuts here. But if you could fix it for 1% of GDP, fix the 2 to 3% problem, that'd be amazing. But what we're currently proposing is rather fix a tiny bit of the problem for about 10% of GDP. And fixing a little bit of 2 to 3% for 10% is just a dumb idea. And so that's really the conversation we need to have. And we can't have that if everybody's just running around like chickens without their heads and saying, oh my God, the world is coming to an end and we just need to do something. So that's the conversation I want to have.
Sure. Well, and I guess the final question on that, and specifically just in the realm of the climate science that currently exists, as I noted, The Skeptical Environmentalist, which is sort of what put you on the radar in climatology, was published in 2001. And I think, obviously since then, climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, has definitely become more of a hot button issue, pun intended, obviously, since 2001, and especially in the past 5-10 years or so. Have you accounted for, perhaps better, more robust climate science in more recent IPCC reports in your calculations? Have your calculations evolved? Have they adapted? Because the thesis that you're sort of presenting that climate change is overblown is very similar to the thesis of the 2001 book, it seems.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And the short answer is, of course I have. I mean, in my latest book, in my latest period article from 2020, I tried to take into account as much as we knew was going to come out with the next set of IPCC reports that started in 2021. So yes, I have obviously taken all this into account. The main sort of charge is that the UN Climate Panel has refined a lot of its knowledge, but there's none of this that has dramatically changed. We pretty much have just, become more certain of all the stuff that we already knew. And so much of this is just simply updating a little bit on the margin. There is a whole conversation, and that's a conversation I'm very happy to have, which is, I've worked with a lot of Nobel laureates in the economics, and Thomas Schelling was one of them. He's been very involved. He's no longer with us, but he was very involved in the climate conversation. One of the things he pointed out was the UN Climate Panel and most of the people working in climate have been talking very much about the central scenarios. So what happens, sort of if the world happens, what we likely think is going to happen. But actually, that's not very interesting because, again, that seems to show that, yes, it's a little bit of a problem, 2 to 3%. What we really should be looking at is sort of these extreme tail end conversations, because those could change. Unfortunately, the UN Climate Panel has not done that. I think to a very large extent because of inertia. When everybody does one thing, that's what you end up doing, and then you'll just keep doing it because that's how you publish and that's how everybody thinks about it. But really, we should be talking much more about some of these conversations. I have some other points to make on that, but again, this is a huge and impossible to cover all of it in one podcast. But this is the kind of conversation that we should be thinking about, and that does indicate we should be a little more concerned because there are some real risks out in these sort of in the edges of what we're talking about, but also we don't know very much about it. And the other thing, of course, is it's not the only thing that we
matters.
don't know very much about. There are lots of risks in the world out to 2100. And I think it's very likely that we have seen only a very few of them, and we're going to be surprised no matter what of what it really was that we should have been concerned about in the 21st century.
Got it. Well, and taking into account those risks, right? They're numerous, economically speaking, otherwise. You've also been an outspoken critic of a lot of the climate-related proposals. Those include the Paris Climate Accords. Those include the Green New Deal, I believe. What are, just to take those two examples, Paris and the Green New Deal, what are the specific issues in the planks of those policies that you feel are counterproductive, are not going to contribute to climate change mitigation and also come at an economic cost?
So the main issue here is not that they're not well-intentioned. I mean, they want to fix a problem, and I love that idea. But they're fundamentally trying to fix it incredibly expensively and mostly in the rich world. And that has two problems. Partly, you're not really going to convince the rest of the world by saying, if you look at sort of the front runner on many climate issues, that's Germany in many ways. And they've been very explicit about saying, we're going to do a lot of stuff. It's going to be very costly. We will have some problems, but then we'll showcase to the world that you can do it. But nobody around the world look at Germany, who's struggling with high power prices and basically ruining most of their heavy industries and so on, and having a hard time paying for all of it. Nobody looks in Germany and say, "Ooh, we'd love to be more like Germany." Right? The problem is if the rich world is trying to say we're going to pay out of our nose in order to try to fix this for ourselves, and then showcase this to the world, we'll actually end up doing the exact opposite. Most people look at Germany as sort of please don't do that, at least. And the other part, and that's an incredibly important part, it has very little to do with the rich world. We emitted most of the CO2 in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, but we will only emit a fairly small bit. So, say 10, 20%, depending on what the world will look like. Most of the emissions are going to come from China, India, and Africa. And that's not entirely true. There's Indonesia and all these other, but it's a sort of easy shorthand for this. And those are the nations that we need to convince. It's not about rich, well-meaning Americans in New Haven or people in Denmark feeling all virtuous and saying, "Oh, we made it. Yes, it cost us a lot of money, but at least we're now virtuous." It's about convincing China, India, and Africa, and they quite frankly have other and more important issues. If you look at it, it's not very surprising. Most of these people actually want to get their populations out of poverty. They want to get what we have. I can't blame them. I would feel the same way if I was in their shoes. And then they will probably also want to eventually care about climate change. And that's why we've got it wrong. We've got it backwards. So when we say, Green New Deal, we're essentially saying let's spend hundreds of trillions of dollars on doing a little bit of good. And depending on how you value it and all that stuff, we'll probably do, say, 10, 15 cents of good for every dollar spent. That's a really, really bad way to help the world. We should be focusing on much, much more effective ways. And the beauty of doing that is if we do it smarter, we can also afford to fix all the other problems, as I just mentioned at the very beginning, right? That for most people on this planet, the big issue is not the temperature in 100 years. It's the fact that my kids will die tonight from malaria or, all these other very, very simple things that you and I don't care about and we don't think about because it's not part of our, sort of lived experience. But for most people, it is. Just to give you one good example of something that we never think of, I mentioned that air pollution is by far the biggest environmental problem. And you and I and everybody else who listens to this podcast will think outdoor air pollution because that's what air pollution is in the rich world. But for most people in the poor world, it's indoor air pollution. It's the fact that you cook and keep warm with dirty fuels like dung, wood, cardboard. And that means that most places indoors, so more than 1 billion huts around the world, they're not all huts, but sort of that's the metaphor you want to have. They have air pollution that is about 10 to 20 times more polluted than the outdoor in Beijing or New Delhi. It's the equivalent of more than 2 billion people smoking 2 packs of cigarettes every day. And we know how to fix that. It's lifting them out of poverty so they no longer have to worry about walking into their kitchen and dying from it. And again, my point, we're a smart species. We can, walk and chew gum at the same time. It's not like we should only focus on this. But what I do worry about is that in our current conversation, our current worry about climate change, it's like we only worry about climate change. And then, when you say this, to all good people that worry a lot about climate, they'll say, oh, yeah, sure. We should also worry about indoor air pollution. No, sorry. But back to climate change.
Sure.
And that's where I'm saying, no, not back to climate. We should focus on climate and be smart. And that's what we should be spending much smarter. And then we should also remember all the other issues.
Got it. That's, I guess, sort of the last question I'd throw out there is what are some perhaps short-term mitigation strategies, maybe not long-term, short-term mitigation strategies you would endorse? There are a lot of proposals by a lot of people, who are into carbon pricing and carbon dividends. That seems to be one popular option. There's direct air capture, which seems incredibly costly. It doesn't seem very popular. There's investments in nuclear energy, a transition to nuclear energy. Do you think that any of these hold water, or do you believe it is a far more pressing issue to get certain nations that are dirtier in their greenhouse gas emissions to be at the economic level that they don't need to pollute as much? Where do you see short-term priorities in an ideal world being placed?
The problem with your question is I'm going to sort of say this is just not going to happen in the short term.
Got it.
There's a great guy on energy called Buckley. He's sort of an old guy. He's literally a very old guy in Canada, and he just speaks the truth on a lot of these things.
Sure.
And he will basically just tell you all the transitions that we've seen. And remember, we haven't really had a good transition ever. But we want to transition away from fossil fuels. This doesn't happen in 10 or 20 years. This happens in half and full centuries. And believing anything else is just silly. Just not going to happen. And we can do all the Germany we want. So one of the things that drives me up the wall is Germany in 2010, when they decided that they did their Energiewende, their climate change policy, which set the stage for all of this. They got 79.6%, and it's important with the point, it'll turn out, of their energy from fossil fuels. And then 12 years later, after having done all of this and spent an enormous amount of money, they probably spent in the order of $700 billion on this, on climate. They get 79.3% of their energy from fossil fuels. They've literally not achieved anything. It'll take half a millennia to get to zero on that path. Of course, part of it is because they were stupid about nuclear. They shut down a lot of nuclear power plants. They'd already paid for it. They already had to decommission them. Of course, you don't shut down nuclear power plants that you've already paid. There's a whole other conversation about whether you build new ones because they're a lot more expensive. But you should definitely not shut down existing nuclear power plants that give you essentially free energy that's CO2 free. That's just a no-brainer. So they've done a lot of stupid things, and some of them I would argue is inherent in the panic that comes along with this. But the fundamental point here is to say we are very, very good at wasting lots of money doing very little. And I would like us, to be more smart, less worried, and because I think the data shows us we should be less worried. If the data showed us we should be worried, I'd be all for going out there and saying that. But we actually have a 2 to 3% problem. Yeah, it's a problem. One of the many things we need to fix in the 21st century. And there's no short-term solutions. The real answer to climate change is this will only be fixed once we find a technology that's cheaper than fossil fuels and is green. And that's why my argument is we should be, and this is not just my argument, I pulled together more than 50 of the world's top climate economists and 3 Nobel laureates to look at where can we actually spend money. And this was their long-term best answer. Dramatically increase investment in green energy R&D so that we eventually innovate the green technology that'll fix this problem. It won't satisfy your question because it's not going to be, we can fix this in 5 years. Right. But once we get it, and let me just say, if we could come up with fourth generation nuclear, I'm a little skeptical, but let's just go with that for a second. If we could get that, small modular reactors, incredibly cheap, and then we just have lots and lots of energy very cheaply, and it'd be totally safe. Let's just assume, then obviously everyone would buy it. You wouldn't need to twist anyone's arm. You wouldn't need to force China or India or Africa to buy them. They'd all just buy them. And so we would, again, remember, electricity is not the whole solution to all of this, but we would be a lot further ahead of this. So the whole point is, if we get a technology that makes this cheaper, we're pretty much done. If we don't, we can keep trying to say, oh, thou need to be virtuous, but it's not actually going to work. And so that's what I'm really pushing for. So I'm sorry, I'm going to answer your question in the negative, because there is no short-term solutions. I'm all for carbon tax, and that can be part of the solution, but honestly, it's not going to be a big part of the solution. And certainly, as we saw in the US, it can very easily be part of the political gridlock, because nobody wants to put on extra taxes and all that stuff. And carbon capture, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But again, we should be investigating it, because again, right now it costs perhaps $500 per ton. That's never going to work. Smart people, much smarter than me, believe that we can probably push it down to $100 per ton. Still not going to happen. But imagine if we could push it down to $5 a ton. Then it would be so cheap that, it still costs $400 billion a year. But I could almost imagine the EU saying, look, we're just going to pay for everyone, and then we don't want to hear anyone complain anymore, right? Sort of thing. Yes, it would still have some other issues there. But if we could make it cheap enough, maybe. So the whole point is, do a lot of stuff, look at a lot of different things. And if we can find just one or a few of these solutions, that will be what fixes climate change. But it's not going to come in 5 years, unfortunately.
There you go. Dr. Lomborg, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
That wraps up another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. Thanks to Owen Tillman for anchoring this one. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.